He raised an eyebrow. Cute, but that shirt doesn't look like it's made for reading today. Harlan tugged lightly at his shirt hem, as if comparing. This collar, this fabric, it's soft to the touch but tears easily. He smiled. I know because my ex-wife used to wear this kind, and when things needed to come off quick, the first thing I'd do was... He thought he was mocking her. What he didn't know was that his words were already lighting a fire across the town, one that would soon have everyone standing up for justice. What state are you in? Have you ever witnessed something like this in your area? Drop a comment and let us know. Just past noon, the wind moved evenly through the brittle trees of Jefferson Park. On a chipped, gray-painted bench, Dana sat reading, her gaze steady as if nothing in the world could intrude on that moment. She had chosen a spot near the drinking fountain, facing a rugged path that led out to the main road, where car horns echoed now and then. The book lay open across her lap, its yellowed pages curled gently around her slender, steady fingers. The kind of hands shaped by someone used to moving slowly in a city that never waits. She wore an orange shirt, the collar pressed sharp, buttons fastened to the top, the hem falling neatly over a dark skirt. Pinned to the breast pocket was an old badge, a keepsake from the community library where she volunteered. None of it was meant to draw attention, but some things, when worn on black skin, become reasons to be looked at twice. A dry chuckle echoed from behind. 2 officers were patrolling. The older one chewed gum while squinting at Dana. Beside him, the younger man furrowed his brow, his back slightly hunched forward, as if on alert for something invisible. Reading in the park at noon, the older one muttered. Dressed for an interview nobody asked her to. Dana looked up as they approached. Her face held no defense, no surprise. She placed a finger between the pages, as if only pausing briefly to respond. "Good afternoon, officers," she said softly. "Is there a problem?" The younger one clicked his tongue. "Where's your ID? You seem like someone who's here, off schedule." "I'm just reading. I didn't bring ID because I didn't think I'd be questioned for doing that in a park." "Well," the older one shrugged. "A lot of black folks thought the same before we found something they shouldn't have carried." The younger man chuckled, tried to hold it back, but his mocking gaze gave him away. The words fell into the quiet like a stain on freshly cleaned tile. Dana closed her book. Her voice wasn't loud, but clear enough to cut through the laughter. "I'll stand up. If you need to verify something, I'm willing to cooperate, as long as it follows proper procedure." The older one waved a hand. "You can stand, but turn around. We need to do a basic check." "You don't need to do that," she said quickly. "I show no suspicious signs, and you have no right to search my body without a formal reason." He didn't answer. Glancing over his shoulder, he noticed a few people had slowed down. A woman walking her dog had stopped at the edge of the grass, her brow furrowed. An Asian student on a skateboard had gently lowered his foot, pretending to fix his laces, just to stay within sight. Then, without warning, the officer stepped straight toward Dana. His hand came up, grabbing her collar between 2 fingers. His eyes didn't change, and he kept chewing his gum. A second later, the sound of tearing ripped through the air as he yanked downward, pulling the shirt off-center from the collar to the chest, revealing the black bra underneath. Dana stepped back on instinct. She tightened her grip on the book in her hand, not to fight back, but to hold on to the one thing still intact. The people around them stared, eyes wide. A college student came to a full stop on his skateboard. A man who had just crossed the lawn also froze, pulling his phone from the pocket of his coat. "You've got an attitude," the officer said flatly, as if he were handling a disappointing product at the store. "Cooperation is how you avoid trouble." Dana didn't reply right away. She inhaled deeply, then looked him directly in the eyes. There was no fear in her stare, only a deep, worn-out exhaustion that needed no name. "You're not searching," she said slowly. "You're reenacting something you think no one dares to watch all the way through. And this time, someone stayed to watch." Harlan stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes sweeping slowly across the crowd that had started to stir around the bench. The rookie beside him kept quiet, clearly still too green to grasp how thin the line was between carrying out duties and abusing power when someone had a phone filming right in front of them. But Harlan was different. He was used to that kind of silence, the kind that had protected him time and again from having to explain himself. He didn't mind being watched. What he minded was being questioned. Dana remained still, her gaze fixed on the tear at her collar, as if trying to hold on to a sense of calm in a moment already distorted. The silver badge on her chest pocket had shifted sharply to one side, creased along the path of the hand that had just yanked it. It hadn't fallen, but it tilted, like something once respected, now touched by someone who had no idea what it was worth. "You look familiar," Harlan said, his voice flat, like he was testing his memory rather than interrogating. "Ah, right, the city library. A few times on patrol I saw you arranging books for the kids." He raised an eyebrow. "Cute, but that outfit today doesn't look like storytime attire." Dana answered with silence, not the kind of silence that gets pushed over, but the kind carefully weighed, as if measuring whether any words could hold back the arrogance now standing in full form before her. In the end, she chose a look, not accusatory, not shaken, but not searching for kindness in a place that had refused to show it from the first sentence. "I don't like the way you're looking at me like I just insulted the divine," Harlan said, pulling his hand from his pocket. "I'm doing my job. You're sitting in the middle of a park, no ID, dressed like you're asking for attention. In a city with a high crime rate, that's called probable cause." The rookie now began to step back slightly. He seemed to be reading the air. Maybe, for the first time in his life as a cop, he was realizing some situations aren't in the manual. Harlan kept talking, as if his words were the final stamp. "I've seen your type. They are educated, know their rights, know the law, and now know how to stir up a crowd too, but in the end, they all get checked. No one's immune." Dana kept her hands by her sides, eyes never leaving his. Part of her wanted to step back, another part didn't, because she knew if today's step back was out of avoidance, then tomorrow, no step forward would be enough to reclaim the dignity already ground into the pavement by that first look. Harlan tugged lightly at the hem of his shirt, as if comparing. "White shirt collar. This kind of fabric is soft, but tears easily." He smiled. "I know because my ex-wife used to like this style, and when it needed to come off quick, the first thing I'd do was..." He raised a hand toward Dana again, but this time there was no action, just a casual gesture. Enough to make the onlookers hold their breath, but also enough for him to pull back without it being called violence. That was the kind of threat that didn't need contact. Just witnesses. The woman near the fountain had raised her phone. She said nothing, but the blinking blue light above the camera showed the video was rolling. Harlan glanced over, then adjusted his cuff. A final kind of display, like he was checking his stance before a frame he no longer controlled. Dana stepped back half a pace. Wind slipped through the torn edge of her shirt, fluttering the fabric to the side like a wound no longer hidden. She turned to the woman filming and gave a slight nod. And in that moment, power had started to shift, not through resistance, but by standing upright in front of someone who always believed no one would ever have the patience to watch him to the very end of his act. Dana's arm was held back, not forcefully, but enough to throw her slightly off balance as the younger officer lightly tightened his grip around her right wrist. She didn't resist. She didn't bow her head. Her gaze remained on Harlan, without raising her voice, without pleading, and without the look of someone who had accepted defeat. In that moment, the entire park seemed to still, not from chaos, but from the intense stillness of someone who had just been violated. "I didn't wear it wrong," she said calmly. "You saw it wrong." The sentence landed like a clean cut, leaving the man speechless. Harlan smirked, but said nothing. He turned away, pretending to check the distant fountain as if nothing worth his time remained. The rookie beside him fumbled with his radio, perhaps to call a superior or simply to escape the clear discomfort of standing between two people who had already said everything without raising their voices. Dana showed no reaction beyond composure, and it was that composure that made the onlookers even more unsettled. A middle-aged woman in a blue shirt slowly took out her phone, not held high, just raised to chest level, enough to frame the scene. She said nothing, but her lips were pressed tight. There was something in her eyes that mirrored Dana's, not asking for protection, but refusing to be dismissed. Within 10 minutes of Harlan stepping back and instructing the rookie to clear the crowd, the first short videos began to surface online. No captions, no hashtags, just footage of a woman's blouse being torn in a park, and a sentence in white text. "I didn't wear it wrong, you saw it wrong." Without needing direction, the public response poured in from every angle. Some comments gasped, "This is happening in the city I once believed to be civilized?" Others tried to rationalize. Maybe she did something before the video started. But most chose the wrong thing to talk about. Wearing a pale blue dress shirt, walking alone through the South Side? Really? Why dress like an undercover academic in a place where people are just trying to survive? "I'm a woman, and I'd never show up to a park dressed like I'm auditioning for a legal drama." Dana became the center of a debate she never invited. What had been torn wasn't just a collar. It was the layered reality of being a black woman in a society that always found fault, not with the hand that reached, but with the one it touched. Malik, an old friend whom Dana had once helped years ago, happened upon the clip while scrolling through the news feed at a gas station near his training camp. He froze, dropping his phone onto the floor, then picked it up without wiping it off. His face tightened, not from shock, but from an all-too-familiar feeling rising too fast, a fury too specific to immediately name. Hours later, news channels began picking up the footage, adding commentary. The evening broadcast opened with the image of torn fabric, but the anchor's voice posed this instead: "Does clothing style contribute to triggering search responses from law enforcement?" No one asked why the police administration remained silent. No one mentioned Dana's answer, clear, firm, and free of anger, now buried under waves of deflection. Somewhere in the city, Dana stayed quiet. She hadn't spoken out, hadn't made a public statement, hadn't returned to the scene. But the video kept spreading, and her words, even as they were twisted, remained. A quiet reminder that truth doesn't live in how we are seen, but in the courage to stare back and refuse to blink. The next morning, during a brief press conference at district headquarters, a union spokesperson stepped to the wooden podium, placed both hands on its edge, and read from a prepared statement. No one in the room was unfamiliar with how these sensitive incidents were handled. Use neutral language, avoid specifics, and never name the person impacted unless they filed a formal complaint. "We confirm," he said, "that according to Clause 14.3 of the Handbook on Suspicious Behavior Assessment in Public Spaces, Officer Brett's action was part of a standard risk evaluation. There is no evidence suggesting overreach or physical misconduct. No one pushed back. No one asked a follow-up question." Local reporters knew that any insistence would result in the meeting being abruptly ended under the excuse of awaiting internal review. They took notes quickly, some already drafting headlines before the statement ended. Online, clips of the press conference were trimmed and reposted with sarcastic captions. "Fabric torn, but nobody touched." A line that seemed gentle, but spread like spilled oil. It struck a nerve many already knew too well, that truth, again and again, is diluted into administrative language. In a forum group for former police officers, an anonymous post appeared just a few hours after the union statement. The content was a single line. If it had been a white woman in a business skirt downtown, who would dare yank her collar? Below the post were more than 500 comments. Most opposed how the department had handled the situation, but not a few said, "In this job, sometimes you choose feeling safe over being proper." Harlan, during that time, was nowhere to be seen. He gave no interviews, wrote no op-eds, and posted no statements. The media called it professional silence. But within the force, many understood he didn't need to speak, because there was a whole system speaking for him. A closed-door meeting was held that afternoon at Administrative Zone 3, where mid-level commanders discussed how to handle the incident. Reports were printed out with red lines highlighting the part that said, "No injuries reported." A senior officer set his pen down on the table and said quietly, "As long as the victim isn't hurt, we still have a gray area to work with." Outside that building, at a small cafe on the corner, Malik sat across from Janelle, a law student who had joined the community legal defense group 3 months ago. Both sat in silence before a laptop screen replaying the press conference. Janelle looked up first, her voice low. "You see, No one mentioned the torn collar. That detail got wiped from the vocabulary. Malik nodded, his hand resting on a cup of untouched tea. They won't mention it, because a shirt doesn't have civil rights, and the person wearing it, she has to defend that herself, if she's strong enough not to let herself become a symbol slowly devoured. In the conversations that followed, many people began avoiding Dana's name. They called her the woman in the park, as if naming her would force them to admit she was a specific person, with a past, with dignity, with a reason to resist. As a vague image, Dana could more easily be filed away among those forgettable incidents. On the third day after the event, a short piece was published in the opinion section of the local newspaper without a byline. The title read, "We do not live in a system without flaws. We live in a system that refuses to say who the flaws belong to." The final line, printed in italics, and when every statement begins with, "No abuse of authority occurred," ask again, who gets to define authority? Holding cell number 6 had only one long bench and a small window lined with frosted glass. A fluorescent tube lit the ceiling, neither dim nor bright enough to see someone's face unless sitting close. Dana leaned against the wall, hands holding the hem of the temporary shirt issued by the officers. The white-collared blouse from the day before had been taken without explanation. Outside the cell, a night-duty officer named Laurel stood recording notes on a clipboard. She looked at Dana for a long moment before speaking. "We need your full name to complete the intake file." Dana looked up, her eyes free of anger, fear, or willingness to comply. "I already gave you my name. Dana is enough." "We need your surname," Laurel stressed, her tone no longer polite but not yet aggressive. "Not today," Dana said without pause. "I won't let my name sit beside the reason he made up." Laurel stopped writing. She wasn't new to the job and had seen all types of reactions from detainees. Some yelled, some cried, some begged for medical attention, but Dana's response was different. It didn't carry the charge of panic or defiance. It was simply a refusal from someone who knew that if she didn't protect her name, no one else would do it right. In a rare moment when work no longer drowned out private thought, Laurel sat at her desk and flipped through the incomplete file. Dana's intake photo was clipped to the upper right corner, her expression blank, the side angle revealing a high cheekbone and a faint bruise near her left temple. No one had noted it. It didn't qualify as an injury. Mid-shift, Laurel went to the break room, where the coffee machine rumbled in slow spurts. In the corner, a tech officer named Jerome was reviewing internal footage, doing the kind of repetitive task most ignored unless something serious had happened. Laurel sat across from him, sighing tiredly. "Cell 6. Her name's Dana. Won't give a surname. Seems stubborn but not looking for trouble." Jerome stopped typing and turned. "Dana? Is she the woman from the library who had her blouse torn in the park?" "Yeah. Held today for refusing to show ID." He nodded, then chuckled. "Imon saved Lieutenant Martin's daughter, you know." Laurel squinted. "What?" "3 years ago, at the Northside Hospital. The girl had anaphylaxis. The doctor was late, and Dana, the only nurse on call, handled it. I know because my wife worked there. No news coverage, no thank you speech, no flowers, no certificate. Lieutenant Martin probably doesn't even remember her name." Laurel went quiet. She recalled Dana's eyes when she declined to write her last name. There was something in those eyes that had endured more than having a collar torn. Maybe she had stayed silent through moments when others received applause. Maybe she never needed her name said out loud, until it was dragged off the human list and stamped onto a checklist labeled "potential threat to verify." When Laurel returned to the cell, Dana was still sitting there, her posture unchanged, as if time in that room moved around her without touching her breath. "I don't need you to write anything for me," Dana said as soon as she saw the clipboard in Laurel's hand. "No," Laurel said, her voice lower now. "I'm just standing here. If you need anything, not for protocol, but for yourself. I'm still on the night shift." There was no response from the other side, but the look had softened. Sometimes, that alone is all a woman needs to keep for herself after her name has been weighed against a torn collar no one thought was worth recording in a report. Malik sat back in a wooden chair inside the old garage where he worked part-time after leaving the military. On the table was an old tablet, its screen scratched diagonally in the top right corner, but still clear enough to show a video recently shared on social media. The image was shaky, the angle tilted, but the sound was unmistakable, the rip of fabric, a woman's voice steady and clear, an air so tightly held it felt like it was trying to contain something bigger than itself. He didn't recognize Dana at first. The clip was too short, and time had changed many things. The last time they met was 15 years ago, during a relief mission after Hurricane Katrina. Back then, Malik was still a young sergeant, not yet understanding how people could fall apart in panic, and not yet knowing that real strength in an emergency didn't come from weapons or uniforms, but from the voice of someone who could calm a crowd without raising theirs. Dana had been a volunteer nurse. They met in a warehouse converted into a shelter for evacuees. A 3-year-old child had a seizure from a high fever. Malik froze, unsure whether to hold on or let go. Dana stepped in, didn't push him aside, didn't say he was wrong. Just placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're holding just fine, I'll take it from here." No commands, no lecturing, just the right move at the right moment. After that, they didn't see each other again. Malik returned to his unit. Dana stayed with the civilian relief team. He didn't have her phone number, didn't know her full name. But that image, how she walked into a room full of crying and made it quiet with her calm, stayed with him for 15 years. And now, he was watching that same woman being pulled by the collar in a city park, not in chaos, not during a crisis, but on a sunny afternoon with trees, benches, and a man who thought he had the right to do it just because he wore a uniform. Malik turned off the video and leaned both hands on the table. He didn't speak for a while. Outside, the buzz of a power saw from the next-door workshop kept going steady, and no one noticed he was holding back an anger that hadn't yet found words. He wasn't the kind to jump at every injustice he saw online, but this time was different. This wasn't just outrage. This was the feeling of someone who owed a debt and knew that staying silent was no longer a neutral stance. He stood up, picked up his phone, and called an old friend from the community legal team. "I need a list of complaints tied to Officer Harlan Breath," he said as soon as the line connected, "and I need to know if she's been contacted by a lawyer yet." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Are you family?" "No, but I owe her." He didn't explain further. No need to bring up the storm or the child from years ago. Malik only knew one thing for sure. That woman never asked to be helped, and never expected anyone to remember. But if silence can be learned, then response can begin from someone who was once helped, without being asked for anything in return. A few days later, he showed up at a community meeting at the local library. No uniform, no badge, just a man stepping up to the microphone to speak about a woman who once helped a child survive, and now had to fight to keep her dignity in the middle of a crowded street. When the moderator asked if he wanted his name on the petition to the city council, Malik nodded. He wrote, "Malik W. once had his sense of humanity saved by a nurse named Dana, and this time he would not stay silent." Janelle sat cross-legged on a thin cushioned chair in the university library, the keyboard in front of her, glowing under the fluorescent lights above. It was group work hour, but she had requested to stay behind alone to finish her section of the final thesis. Her topic was transparency in internal complaint handling within law enforcement agencies, an uncommon choice that professors often gently reminded her to approach neutrally and with legal caution. Janelle wasn't surprised that most of the data she found was heavily redacted files. She had grown used to opening PDFs only to see pages masked in thick black ink, dense and cold like a curtain. But that day, while browsing the archive of a nonprofit legal group, she stumbled upon an unusual file. The file name was unremarkable, just a string of identifying numbers, but when opened, she discovered notes that had accidentally remained under the redactions, draft comments that hadn't been erased before submission. In those lines, one name appeared 4 times. Harlan Brett. According to the notes, Brett had previously been the subject of 3 complaints for excessive interference with the upper body of searched individuals, all of which were categorized as not procedural violations. One report included an internal remark: officers should be reminded to adjust tone when interacting with female subjects. That phrase made her stop, not because it was new, but because it was painfully familiar. She had seen this type of language in dozens of other files, always emphasizing subjects, softening assault into intervention, turning reminders into non-binding recommendation. That night, as she left the library, Janelle realized she was being followed. She wasn't sure how she knew, but the sense was clear. A man in a gray jacket stood near the parking lot too long, eyes not on his phone, not leaving after she got in her car. She circled the academic buildings twice, and he kept just enough distance to stay legal, just enough to send a cold sweat down her back. There was no confrontation, no threat. But when she returned home and reopened her laptop, the file she had downloaded from the legal archive was gone from her drive. Malik found Dana at the community library, where she still came to shelve books and help children with homework every Monday afternoon. She was standing between 2 shelves in the children's section, organizing worn-out comic books. No bodyguard, no lawyer, no reporters. As if her life had never been yanked off course by a gloved hand in the middle of a public park. He stood there for a while before speaking. "I need to know how far you want to take this." Dana didn't turn around. Her hand stayed on an open book. "Take it where? To fight? To sue? To speak out? To drag this case into the light? To make him answer? I don't want you to stay silent." This time Dana turned. Her eyes were not tired as he expected, but they also weren't blazing like someone about to step up to a podium. "I don't want to go anywhere," she said slowly. "I just don't want to have my blouse torn again." Malik nodded, asking nothing more. He understood that some people didn't need a podium or a microphone to make others reconsider, and some forms of endurance, when held quietly, carried more force than any slogan. She handed him a small notebook, handwritten, a list of children who had come to the library, those needing reading support, those without access to online learning. "If you want to do something, start with this," she said, "keeping them from becoming smaller versions of those dragged in public. That's enough." He took it without a word, and both of them, though they didn't step outside that quiet room, had already started walking toward a place no internal memo, no blackout ink, no suspicious gaze could read. In the storage room in the basement of Precinct 12 headquarters, the smell of old paper, mixed with printer ink, created a thick, familiar air for those who had spent hours between file cabinets without speaking. There were no ringing phones, no air conditioning, only the occasional whine of a printer and the steady sound of shoes moving across worn tile. At the end of the aisle, a technician named Harris was bent over, reviewing a batch of old digital records converted into hard copies. He hadn't been assigned to the Dana case. He wasn't even part of any unit handling internal complaints. But he remembered the name Harlan Brett, and he remembered an incident once filed under internally resolved, no further monitoring required. At the time, the officer who signed off was a mid-level commander named Randall, retired now for 2 years after nearly 3 decades in the force. Harris still recalled that day when Randall entered the records office and sat in silence for more than 10 minutes before signing the report. Just a signature. Then he walked out, leaving a mark of blue ink that Harris had thought was unusually dark. The file Harris found that morning was a faint photocopy, the top edge slightly singed from a small past fire in the archive room. The body of the page had been blacked out with a marker, but when tilted under the yellow light, a few blurred words remained visible, enough to tell this wasn't a routine administrative report. There were no direct orders, no one had asked for a reprint, but Harris, after verifying the timestamp, decided to extract a clean copy before the file was sent to command, for review as prompted by public demand. The printer worked slowly, as if it too sensed the weight of each word. When the final page slid out of the tray, Harris picked it up, careful not to smudge the ink. At the very bottom of the document, just above the line that read, internal, not for public release, restricted circulation, was the familiar signature, R.L. Randall. No one in the archive room knew what Harris was doing. He placed the copy into a different file folder, unlabeled, then stored it in his private drawer and locked it with a physical key. As he stepped into the hallway, the light from the stairwell leading to the ground floor cast across his worn-out face. But there was still something in his eyes that hadn't gone out. Like, through all the years working with documents, Harris had held on to an old principle. If someone signed off on something wrong, then sooner or later, someone had to turn the page back and read it right from the beginning. That night, before leaving headquarters, Harris slid a small note under the desk of a trusted colleague, someone he knew had studied with Randall and stayed in touch. The note had nothing on it but a case number and a line in handwriting. File 47. Don't let anyone edit it again. A reprint couldn't change the past, but it could be the first piece in a chain of things never admitted. And sometimes, for everything to shift, it only takes one person quietly pausing. At the moment, the ink still holds. The third-floor meeting room at City Hall was packed. Chairs were filled from front to back, and the aisles along both sides were already lined with people who hadn't arrived early enough to sit. Ceiling fans spun quietly in the heavy April air, but what weighed the room down wasn't heat. It was the kind of tension no breeze could lift, unease threading through glances, through side eyes, through every fidget too slow to hide. On the raised platform, the presiding official in a charcoal suit flipped through the stack of papers before him, eyes locked on the lines like he was searching for language safe enough to say out loud. He tapped his pen softly on the table, speaking not to the crowd, but to the camera, voice steady as if addressing a future version of himself on the evening news. Regarding the incident at Jefferson Park, he began, we affirm that the city takes all complaints related to law enforcement conduct seriously. However, he paused. In that pause, a few soft coughs echoed. A boy on tiptoe tried to peek past the adults in front. An elderly woman furrowed her brow, as if bracing for whatever would be left unsaid this time. We, the official resumed, cannot assign motive without sufficient evidence. The sentence made no noise but left a long fracture in the air, like a silent crack across glass just wiped clean. From below, a middle-aged man raised his hand. He wore no suit, no name tag, just an ordinary citizen with a hoarse voice, perhaps from speaking over a crowd. Sir, he said, when someone gets their collar yanked in a public park, what more do we need to understand motive? Do we need them to fight back or to scream loud enough? The question went unanswered. The official turned to his clerk, whispered something, then looked up with a half smile colored by discomfort. We are gathering more data from independent sources. Once the process is complete, if any irregularities are found, we will pursue further investigation. Janelle sat near the bag, gripping her bag lightly. Inside were copies of internal notes she had uncovered, documents she knew would never make it onto the official table without someone to vouch for their legal legitimacy. She didn't speak today, but she observed, and she understood clearly that this meeting wasn't for answers. It was a way to buy time while public pressure still made people stay in their seats and listen. A high school student, not yet 16, suddenly stepped into the aisle. He wore a school uniform shirt, held no notes, and looked straight toward the podium. If that had been my mother, he said, would anyone here have the courage to say you'd still be waiting on more data? When the meeting ended, no decisions were made. Only a transcript was recorded, capturing the public statements. But in the notebook of a young legal aide, one line was underlined twice, cannot assign motive without sufficient evidence, and just below it, written in a smaller, shakier hand, then when is it ever enough? The seats were still full. People remained seated. On the dais, the presiding official had passed the presentation to a young legal assistant who was reading out figures on community feedback collected over the past few weeks. Numbers on public trust in law enforcement, the quantity of resolved complaints, and technical phrases like redirected handling or balanced power approach were recited as if someone was trying to prove everything remained under control. Then a small hand went up. A student in the third row, slender frame, neatly kept black hair, and a uniform still pressed with fresh folds. His teacher, sitting beside him, leaned over with a subtle signal, likely telling him to wait, but the student stood. "May I ask," his voice was much clearer than his appearance suggested, "if the person whose shirt was torn in the park were my mother? Would any of you have stood up?" No one spoke. The moderator hesitated with the microphone, trying to regain the rhythm, but the student had finished. Just one sentence, no emphasis, no repetition. But it fell over the room like a small stone, touching the surface of what had seemed a calm lake. The microphone went silent for several seconds afterward, but its echo remained. A few people bent over to take notes, unclear whether they felt it needed recording or simply didn't know where else to look. A young woman covered half her face with her hand, unable to hide her reddened eyes. On the dais, the presiding official adjusted his tie, quickly turned a page as if he had lost his place in his speech. The student said nothing more. He sat back down, not defiant. His face showed no anger, nor did it seek praise. It was simply a question and a silence that spread like silent proof of something no data could replace. The act of wondering. A soft sound came from the row near the wall, where older attendees usually sat. An elderly woman stood. No one noticed immediately because she held no microphone, called no name, gave no signal to speak, but she still walked straight toward the wooden table at the center of the meeting room, slowly and steadily. On her coat was a small badge pinned near her left shoulder. Under the light, it reflected a dull silver. Those familiar with the service recognized it instantly. It was the badge given to retired officers who had served 30 full years, usually kept as an honorary token. She approached the speaking table, paused briefly, then unpinned the badge. No sound, no words. She placed it on the tabletop, turned the face of the badge outward toward the room, as if to make sure everyone could see it. The presiding official seemed about to say something, but the woman had already turned back and returned to her seat. No one stopped her, and no one asked why she did it. Those nearby lowered their heads. A few placed their hands over their chests, as if to ask themselves whether, if that had been their badge, they would have had the courage to remove it. The badge remained there for the rest of the meeting, untouched. It was not entered into the record, nor did it appear in that night's television report. But in the minds of those present, it became a symbol of something that could not be captured in writing, a wordless act that quieted the room because it carried an unspoken question. If the one who once wore this badge no longer believes in the reason to keep it, then what exactly is being protected? No one knew where the clip came from, only that it surfaced Monday morning, posted by a previously unknown personal account. No bio, no profile photo, no other posts, but the video was clear, steady, and precisely framed. Unlike earlier clips that only showed a hand pulling at fabric or captured faint voices, this time Harlan Brett's face was visible, every wrinkle between his brows, every movement of his mouth before he grabbed Dana's collar, and even his step back afterward. The footage began from a distance, behind the trees at the park's edge. The zoom was digital, noticeable by the slight pixel fraying at the edges, but the steadiness and focus of the shot made it clear the camera wasn't recording out of shock. It was deliberate. The lens didn't just focus on Dana. It tracked Harlan's every move, how he approached, leaned in, then yanked, actions that took less than 10 seconds but transformed the moment from possibly explainable to undeniably intense. The video spread at lightning speed. For the first time since the incident, public discourse began to shift. No longer were people debating Dana's clothing or behavior. The focus was now on Harlan and the unnerving calm on his face during the act. Within 3 hours, major news outlets had identified the account's owner. It wasn't a journalist, an activist, or even a random witness. It was Liana Monroe, a junior at Northcrest High School and the only daughter of Judge Caleb Monroe, who held a seat on the state appellate court. The fact that a young person from such a high-profile legal family had deliberately recorded and released the clip sent the story in a new direction. It no longer lived in ambiguity. It could no longer be dismissed as inconclusive. Harlan, for the first time, had shown up enough to lose the protection of uncertainty. That afternoon, Liana appeared before the press with her hair tied back, wearing a gray t-shirt and bearing none of the expressions expected from someone who had just ignited a national conversation. Beside her stood the family's spokesperson, a middle-aged lawyer who offered a brief introduction and concluded, "Liana will answer all questions directly, but we will not be taking any inquiries regarding her father." The first question came quickly. Why didn't she intervene? Why didn't she speak up? Why only record? Liana took the microphone, not flinching under the lights. Her voice was calm, not stiff, but firm enough that listeners could tell she wasn't reading from a script. "Because I knew no one would believe it without his face," she said. "I've heard my mom talk about cases thrown out for lack of direct evidence. I've seen clips dismissed for not showing a clear view. I didn't want something this obvious to be denied just because it wasn't filmed at the right angle." A reporter pressed, "Do you believe what you did was morally right?" She paused a moment. "I didn't record the video to be a good person. I recorded it so I wouldn't have to stay silent if the worst happened. And in that moment, I felt that it was more necessary than an uncontrolled intervention." Some criticized her for standing behind the camera, for not shouting, not grabbing a hand, not jumping in. But on another layer of social media, many young people resonated with her clarity, a silent but deliberate act when trust in the system requires not just evidence, but time and irrefutability. After the press conference, the video kept spreading, unedited, and what unsettled many wasn't the yank on the shirt, but Harlan's face, unshaken, unblinking, as if he had done it more than once before. But this time, he didn't turn away fast enough to avoid being seen. Beneath the high dome of the state courthouse, where words, once written into law, had become the perfect cover for silence, a press briefing was held amid swelling public outrage. Media from all over packed into the large courtroom, where spectator seats no longer served citizens attending a trial, but became a stage where people sought answers to what everyone saw, but no one wanted to take responsibility for. Judge Caleb Monroe stepped up to the podium in his usual dark suit, but this time without his leather notebook or thick folder. He came alone, no legal aid, no spokesperson. And even as he stood before dozens of microphones, his eyes did not scan the lenses, but focused on an invisible spot in the room, where an answer from the system he once believed could correct itself should have been. He did not mention Liana, did not refer to being a father, did not name Harlan. No names were spoken, no one was directly accused, but in every chosen word, in every pause between lines, what came through clearer than any statement was the bitter disappointment of a man who once wrote laws, once sat in judgment, but now saw that the justice system no longer bowed to justice. It bowed to indifferent clauses. "We created internal investigations to make sure no one is wrongly accused," he said, "but we have no process for dealing with those who have never once been questioned." A reporter raised a hand to ask about the video, about his daughter, about whether he had any role in revealing the identity. But he lifted his hand in return, not with force, but with a gaze that made the entire room pause. "I'm not here to defend my family," he said slowly, "nor to apologize on anyone's behalf. I only have one question, and I hope at least one of you here will have the courage to write it down. Word for word." He looked up. "Why does it take a child to risk everything just to record an adult doing wrong?" That question landed in the air like a hand slapped on an old wooden table. It wasn't an accusation, but it carried a kind of pain hard to describe. The pain of someone who once believed justice would come if you waited long enough. And now he saw his daughter, a minor, had done what the profession he gave 4 decades to had yet to achieve: capture the truth without framing it. Someone quietly closed a laptop. Someone else looked at the person next to them, as if checking whether they were the only one wounded by the question. But Judge Monroe didn't wait for an answer. He ended the speech without a closing line, stepped down as if there was nothing more worth saying. The media didn't get what they came for. No powerful statement, no tears, no pre-written message, but they got what was needed. A crack in the moral armor the justice system had long wrapped itself in. And from that crack, people began to ask themselves, if even a judge has to ask questions instead of delivering answers, maybe what needs review isn't a single act, but the way an entire society has been trained to look away. Under pale fluorescent lights, the internal hearing room on the third floor of the Southside Precinct bore no trace of being a place where truth was ever meant to be heard. The ceiling was low, the walls painted gray, the wooden table chipped at the corners, a setting more suited to suppression than to finding clarity. But this time there were no raised voices, no open recording devices. Just a row of plastic chairs and 3 men in plain shirts sitting across from Harlan Brett. He walked in with a casual gait, wearing the same smirk, a look hovering between disdain and smugness. No one greeted him. He didn't wait. Sitting down with arms crossed, he looked directly at the man holding the list of questions and spoke before anyone else could. "I know what you're here for," he said. "Some fake apology or a half-denial. I don't play that game." The man across from him kept a neutral face, asking in an even tone, "Have you watched the video?" "I don't need to," Harlan replied, eyes unblinking. "I know what I did, and I'm not calling it grabbing a woman's blouse. I grabbed what looked like a threat." The room went quiet for 3 breaths. Then another man asked. She stood still, showed no threatening behavior. "What did you base that threat on?" "Professional instinct," he said with a shrug. "We're trained to detect danger before it explodes. Waiting to see a knife is too late." She had no knife. She had something in her bag. I didn't know what, but her hand was near her chest. Stiff collar, easy to hide something sharp. And her eyes. They weren't grateful to be searched. That look was provoking. The last word pulled the air tight, not because it was harsh, but because it was familiar. This wasn't the first time they'd heard an officer justify force with a victim's gaze. The difference was this time there was footage. And Dana's face wasn't provocative. It was calm, as if she had expected it all. One of the 3 men, the oldest, with salt and pepper hair, leaned down and pulled a printed internal report on Harlan. He had 3 prior warnings for exceeding boundaries during civilian checks, all scrubbed from public record. 2 were labeled misjudgment. 1 as insufficient evidence. This time was different. This time, the misjudgment had been broadcast live to the entire country. "Harlan," the older man said, "do you see anything in that clip that makes you think you should have acted differently?" He leaned back, arms folded, voice lower but still firm. "What I see is a weakening society, a place where cops can't touch anyone, yet are expected to stop everything. I did what I had to do. If someone doesn't like it, that's because they've never worked the streets." No one responded. The room didn't tighten from tension, but from what had been exposed. Harlan felt no remorse. He didn't believe he was wrong, and he wasn't afraid to say so. The last man spoke, his voice steady and deep. "We didn't call you in for a sociology lecture. We called you because you tore a woman's blouse in public, and we need to know in all that you just said what part of it you call responsibility." Harlan smiled, raised his eyebrows, and replied like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "My responsibility is to act. The consequences, that's your job." The hearing ended with no conclusion. But what unsettled the 3 men most wasn't Harlan's words. It was the calm in his eyes. Because it showed he wasn't an exception. He was the product of a system, and he believed that the system still had his back. The atmosphere in the auditorium that year was nothing unusual. Rows of blue fabric chairs were neatly aligned, the projector ran smoothly, and the hum of the air conditioner filled the silence between slide transitions. Harlan Brett, then a rookie with a close-cropped haircut and eyes not yet clouded by field encounters, sat in the 3rd row, hands neatly placed on the desk. Everything followed protocol so closely that no one noticed anything wrong. The training officer that year was Lieutenant Colonel E. Rollins, a 25-year veteran of the force, considered the right angle of the system for having never faced scandal or internal investigation. He opened the risk assessment lecture with a question. If you had only 10 seconds to choose who to check, who would you pick? No one raised a hand. He answered himself, moved to the next slide, where a red underlined line appeared. Fully clothed, no bag, standing still for long, risk level high. Below it was an illustration, a dark-skinned woman in a buttoned-up blouse, hands resting in front of her stomach, standing near a bus stop. "We don't profile by race," Roland said. "We profile by behavior." He stressed each word as if shielding himself from future accusations. "If this image makes you think of a specific group, that's your issue, not the slides." A few chuckles followed, not out of humor but shared understanding. Harlan did not laugh. He took notes quickly, clearly, underlining the phrase, "standing still for long, high risk." Later, when the Dana incident broke out, that was the exact phrase he repeated like a charm of immunity. Outside the auditorium that day, someone stood silently behind the one-way glass, where the entire training session could be watched without being seen. It was Deputy Director Raymond Parks, responsible for reviewing training content before official implementation. He had seen that slide from the first draft, had read the bullet points recommending subjects who exhibit non-interactive behavior with surroundings. He made no edits, filed no objections. Among hundreds of documents submitted from other states, this one had been rated optimized for rapid response, a top priority in the post-terrorism era. That day, Parks stood for only about 5 minutes. But he remembered clearly. No one in the room asked a question. No dissenting voice was raised. And when he signed the approval slip for training material for active duty forces, his hand did not shake, because he had believed, like many others, that the system knew what to keep. A year later, when the Harlan incident spread, when the video showed Dana standing still on the roadside, Parks stood in the hallway on the 4th floor of internal headquarters, where senior officials never appeared in official investigations. He looked through the frosted glass into the room where Harlan was being questioned. No one knew he was there, but in his eyes was the silent acknowledgement that a click of the mouse years ago had become a cut that would never fade from the page. He said nothing, just closed his eyes as if hoping that a few seconds without sight might help him forget what he had once signed off on. But in his mind, the image of that slide did not fade. It still appeared, white background, black letters, red underline, like a mark in memory that no system ever teaches how to erase. In the late afternoon, the community market at the corner of Wentworth was usually filled with vendor calls, the smell of grilled corn, and the rhythm unique to Southside's black neighborhoods. But today, everything had been pushed to the edges to make room for a circle of old plastic chairs and a microphone placed in the middle. There was no stage, no backdrop, just a clearing in the street, a space meant for rolling carts, now turned into a community hearing. Nearly 200 people stood around, some seated, others leaning against walls, all quiet as if waiting for someone to begin. A young woman in a gray hoodie stepped up to the microphone. She didn't give her name, just looked ahead and spoke slowly. "That year I got stopped for carrying a backpack that was too big. They said I looked like someone who robbed a pharmacy. I cried." They laughed. An older woman gave a slight nod. Then the second speaker stepped forward, a fish vendor with a surgery scar on his left arm, voice hoarse. "I was shoved against a wall after my shift. Someone had called about a vagrant in the parking lot. I was in uniform, the uniform of their own company." The third speaker was a college student, the fourth, a mother, the fifth, a 14-year-old boy. Each told of being stopped, searched, or questioned in public simply because they looked like someone who once caused trouble. No one shouted, no one cursed, but each story cut like a slow blade, steady, clean, needing no blood to make people shiver. A light-skinned man in a dark suit stood quietly near the edge. After a moment, he stepped forward, his voice bearing the cadence of someone well-educated. "I'm a lawyer. But last year I was asked to open my trunk while taking my kid to karate class. The reason? My car had out-of-state plates and I looked tense. I stayed quiet that day because I didn't want my child to see me lose composure. But today, I need to say it." In the crowd, a woman rubbed her hands together as if trying to keep a memory from surfacing. She rose, looked directly at the mic without notes. "I worked in the ER one night. A shooting victim came in. When I approached, police held me back, said I needed to step aside because I wasn't in the proper uniform. I had worked there for 8 years. The silence between testimonies wasn't filled with music or applause. Each person finished, walked back quietly, as if unloading a stone they'd carried too long. No arguments, no rebuttals. But in that calm unity, a truth settled. What happened to Dana wasn't an exception. It was part of a pattern where black bodies and dignity are constantly asked to be verified for no reason at all. A girl around 12, wearing a plaid dress, stepped to the mic. She didn't speak right away. She looked around and whispered, "My mom says not to stay too long in the park if I wear a hoodie, because someone might ask, 'Who are you waiting for?' I'm not waiting for anyone. I just want to sit alone." The entire market went silent. An old man nearby closed his eyes and bowed his head. A few wiped their eyes, but no one objected. There was nothing to object to. Truth doesn't need to be proven when it's echoed by too many voices, in too many places, told in too many ways. As the sun dipped low, the mic was unplugged, but no one left right away. A white woman in her 50s, who had sat silently at the back, stepped forward without the mic and spoke just loud enough. "I'm a teacher, and I believe no child should be taught to stay quiet when they've been disrespected." That day, no one was arrested. No one was pardoned either. But in the heart of the city, once labeled a high-risk zone, a hearing took place, not to convict, but to remind the truth can still be heard if someone is willing to tell it. A man stepped out from the back row, lean but upright, his face partly hidden under the shadow of an old baseball cap. No one knew his name, no one prompted him to speak, but the way he walked into the circle and stood at the microphone, as if he had been waiting for that moment a long time, brought the entire marketplace to a pause. He held no notes, made no adjustments to the mic. He just stood there, hands loosely closed, his voice low, shaped more by long nights of silence than by argument. "Someone asked," he began, "what it is we want." He paused, looking at the silent faces in front of him. "Forgiveness?" He shook his head slightly. "No, we don't need forgiveness. We need to be acknowledged as having been right." A light breeze passed through, carrying the scent of grilled meat from a stand across the street, but no one moved. Those seemingly simple words touched a wound that had never been named, a wound carried by those who had shouted before, had spoken up, had written letters, signed names, marched, presented evidence, and were labeled as extreme, unfounded, overly sensitive. And now, with a video confirming it all, they were being asked for gentleness, humanity, and forgiveness. "We used to say the system was broken. You told us we were imagining things," he continued, his eyes now fixed on the mic. "We told stories about friends pushed into walls, about our kids stopped on the street. You asked us for proof." He stopped again, as if waiting to see if anyone dared claim they had never doubted it. "And now," he said, with the footage clear, with his face out there, with the torn suit no longer just a story, now people ask, "Can you forgive?" A young woman nearby bowed her head, hiding tears in her hand. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, as if sensing the weight of the silence. The man drew a deep breath, then spoke with clarity. "We don't need you to kneel. We don't need you to raise your hands. We need you to stand upright and say that we were not wrong." He turned, walked away from the mic without hesitation, and took one step back to his old seat. But what he left behind was not the echo of a speech. It was the weight of a single essential request, acknowledgement. An elderly woman behind him murmured, "He shouldn't have had to say that today. We should have said it a long time ago." And in that moment, no one needed to raise signs. No one needed to chant. What echoed loudest wasn't in the microphone, but in the way one person's eyes met another's, that some things can no longer be denied, once they've been proven by the silence of those who once refused to listen. In front of a simple camera set up in the community center, lied unevenly across his time-worn face, Randall sat upright, both hands resting on his lap. He hid nothing and didn't show remorse with rehearsed gestures. In the surrounding silence, his voice emerged, slow, raspy, and without a single wasted word. "I used to erase civilian statements," he said, "not because I was ordered to, not for money, but because I thought No one cared about them anyway. The sentence didn't cause a stir, but it made a few people pause mid-step near the door. A truth laid bare, no excuse, no softening, and precisely because of that, it hit harder. Randall continued without breaking rhythm, that in over 30 years of service, he'd seen countless cases go nowhere, not for lack of evidence, but because that evidence was never put where it mattered. I used to tell myself if they couldn't fight the system, then their truth wouldn't last long either. He didn't say this to justify anything, but to expose how indifference worked when carried out as routine, not command. Then he pulled out an old file. The cover yellowed, its corners slightly crumpled like it had been pressed in a drawer for years. One corner had peeled tape, and in the center, red capital letters read, "Internal, not for release, case Dana M." Randall looked straight into the lens as he placed it on the table. I wasn't the only one who saw this file, but I'm the only one still alive to admit I kept it and didn't send it. The cameraman said nothing, just tightened his grip on the lens. Behind them, a woman laid a hand on Randall's shoulder, not to comfort, but to bear witness. Randall slowly opened the file. Inside were reports with crossed-out paragraphs, testimony transcripts with changed handwriting mid-sentence, and a black-and-white photo of Dana at a field clinic after Hurricane Katrina. "She once saved a police officer's life," he said, pointing to the note beneath. "But when she got pulled into this case, the system didn't bother to look at anything beyond the field report." He paused, voice less steady now. "No one asked who she was, they only asked what she had on her, what she wore. Hand out along, she stood outside the bookstore." Outside, the sound of children laughing in a nearby playground contrasted sharply with the stillness inside the room. Randall looked up, his eyes red but dry. "I'm not saying this to be forgiven," he whispered, "but if I stay silent, then my entire life will be a file without a final line." He closed the file and pushed it forward. "I can't fix anything now, but at least someone else will know what was erased." That moment made no noise, but in that small room in Southside, a piece of justice was laid back in place, not by a hero, but by someone who had once failed and chose to face it. The next morning, as the Southside market still dozed under a light fog and the soft rattle of carts over stone, a vegetable vendor noticed something unusual on the old wall behind the stalls. He quietly called someone over, then a few more. In minutes, a circle had formed around a patch of concrete once covered by torn advertisements, now unusually clean, as if someone had wiped it down overnight. Written in thin, even white chalk, it read, "A confession doesn't undo the wrong, but it can stop a new one." The words weren't angry. They didn't try to explain anything. They just stood there like a shard of mirror in the middle of the city, reflecting what everyone had felt but hadn't dared to name. A child looked up and asked her mother, "Who wrote that?" The mother didn't answer right away. She stared at the words and finally murmured, as if asking herself, maybe someone who used to stay silent. News of the message spread quickly, without the media. Within hours, shops around the market paused business just to look. An elderly man came to carefully retrace the chalk, afraid rain would wash it away. A group of college students showed up, stood still, then left without taking photos, as if they understood it wasn't meant to be saved on a phone. It was meant to be remembered. In another corner of the market, Malik stood leaning against a lamppost, eyes fixed on the wall. He said nothing, gripping an old notebook tightly. Inside, it was a list of names, people once mentioned in street stop reports that no one ever followed up on. He had been trying to piece them together, one by one, from small cases quietly filed away, hoping to trace the forgotten. But today, he set the notebook aside. Janelle came too. The law student wore no suit, carried no laptop, just a thin gray jacket, standing beside an elderly woman. The two said nothing, only looked at the same spot on the wall. In the early light, that thin white chalk line appeared so sharply it might have been etched in stone. That made the moment even more distinct, because for the first time in a long stretch of days, No one needed proof to know the truth was present. Not everything right must be shouted, and not every wound needs to be exposed to be believed. Randall did not show up that morning. He stayed home, turned off his phone, and sat on the old wooden chair looking out at the backyard. But when his wife told him what had happened, he smiled faintly, a smile that redeemed nothing and asked for no forgiveness. Just a moment, as if he had finally set down something he had carried on his back for far too long. That wall never became a memorial. No fences were put around it, but in the days that followed, it became the place people paused when they didn't know where else to begin. A single line, handwritten by someone unnamed, and because of that, it belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, ever been touched without being asked, ever been searched like a foreign object on their soul. And for the first time, in a place where people once only passed each other with lowered heads and hurried steps, they stopped to read, to remember, and to see one another as human beings, not moving targets in some training slide. The Federal Department of Justice issued no grand announcement. They didn't arrive in convoys or headline news. But during the final week of that month, a discreet notice was sent to the Office of Police Disciplinary Oversight in Chicago. Federal inspectors would step in. What shocked people wasn't the involvement. It was the depth of the attached file. 76 pages. No legal analysis, no opinions, no recommended penalties. Just a blunt list, bullet-pointed, of incidents dismissed due to no immediate threat to life. Each incident was a story. Dana appeared at number 39. Next to her name, no further detail beyond. Collar pulled, blouse torn in public, no resistance, no medical outcome. Everything that had shaken the city for weeks was compressed into a single line, like a minor parking lot fender bender in an official report. When the list reached the Oversight Council, an emergency session was called. No one could finish reading it in one morning. But the number 76, and how all these once dismissed moments now stood in plain view, made the room feel heavier. One member whispered, "If the first 39 stayed silent, how many after them never got the chance?" Elsewhere, at a district office, an internal hearing request was filed. It was short, without legal representation. The applicant was a young officer named Torres, the one who had been with Harlan that day. On his form, the reason for the request was a single printed sentence: "I didn't touch her." But I didn't stop him either. No one asked him to write that. Internal policy allowed officers in uncertain threat situations full exemption from liability. But Torres didn't choose that path. He arrived early, left the form on the clerk's desk, signed the intake slip, and walked away. No contact left, no conversation held. News of the hearing request spread faster than officials preferred. A journalist caught wind after a clerk casually mentioned an officer requesting to be investigated. For the first time in years, the media had a face in the middle. Not fully a victim, not quite a perpetrator. Just someone who had stood beside wrong and didn't know what to do until it was too late. Malik read the news in silence. Janelle clicked the article and pinned it to the community center board. Dana did not comment. But in her eyes, something shifted, as if silence, once powerless, had started to carry the weight of a different kind. Not a protest, not resistance, just the gravity of looking directly at those who once looked away and forcing them to ask, "If I could go back to that moment, would I step in?" The Justice Department's list didn't lead to action. It offered no conclusions, but each name was a tile, and placed side by side, they formed a picture no one could ignore. Torres's form was only a piece of paper, but for those long denied the chance to name what they witnessed, that paper was a door. Not for someone to walk out, but so that, for the first time, someone chose not to remain in the dark. On a street corner in South Chicago, where most storefronts had closed since the pandemic, one old print shop still opened every Wednesday and Saturday. No signboard, no ads, just the steady hum of a dot matrix printer whenever someone pressed the button. The shop owner, a man in his 60s with dark skin and a hunched back but still strong hands, had once been an offset technician before the trade faded. He didn't ask much of his customers, just the content and the quantity, but this time, what was handed to him made him pause. A white sheet of paper, basic font. The only line in the center of the page read, "She didn't speak loudly or shout, but we heard her." One sentence, cold and clear, printed on an A4 sheet like a message that needed no reply. The print shop owner looked up at the young man standing before him, tall, thin frame, baseball cap pulled low, no identity revealed. "How many copies?" he asked. 100, and if possible, another 100. I'll come back." Without letting his voice shake or show emotion, the man handed over cash, nodded, and walked out, as if printing that message was the only reason he had come. The first sheet was placed on the cutter, then neatly packed into brown paper bundles. But by that night, the pages had begun to appear in unexpected places. On bulletin boards near the bus stop, across pharmacy windows, on power poles outside the high school. No one claimed to have printed them, no one had seen putting them up, but they spread like ink stains that couldn't be scrubbed out, pressing into public awareness with a bluntness that required no explanation. A high school student saw the paper while riding his bike to tutoring. He stopped, read it, then texted a friend. Someone printed what we were too scared to say. A single mother found one taped to her mailbox. She carefully removed it, then stuck it on her kitchen window, as if it were the only thing tying her tiny home to the rest of the city. A retired teacher tucked a copy into the pages of his journal, the one filled with hundreds of entries about things he had seen but never believed he could change. Each small printout accomplished what hundreds of calls to action might not. It made people pause, not to rage, but to acknowledge that they had seen, had heard, and this time could no longer claim not to know. The message made no accusation. It is simply stated, but the way it was stated made it impossible to turn away. Dana was told about the pages while sitting in the office of the community lawyer. She said very little. Quietly, she opened her bag and pulled out an old notebook, the one she used to log patients' heart rates back when she was a nurse. Now, she wrote one line in blue ink, "We heard." Then she closed it, marking a truth that this time would not be written out of the record. In the days that followed, the city was not shaken by protests or loud debates, but the neighborhoods started talking more. People began to tell each other about the time they were touched without reason, the time their daughter came home and stayed silent for a week. In the small interrogation room with no recording devices, a single hanging bulb cast harsh light over the metal table, making the space feel both cold and heavy. Torres walked in, still in uniform, shoes polished. He didn't look around, didn't ask who would be questioning him. He had been told that morning, though part of him hoped he'd heard wrong. That hope vanished the moment the door closed behind him, and in walked the man he had once considered his role model, Lieutenant Raymond Hall. Raymond didn't sit right away. He stood across from Torres, arms folded, eyes carrying neither anger nor disappointment, just the silence of someone who knew exactly what had happened and what never should have. He pulled out the chair slowly, sat down, and looked directly at Torres, tilting his head slightly, like a father trying to understand what his son had done behind his back. "You know, you may never get promoted after that statement, right?" His voice was no louder than the slow-turning fan above, but it cut deeper than any warning Torres had ever read in the department manual. Torres stayed still, leaning forward slightly. "I know." He said nothing more. No but, no explanation. Raymond gave a slight nod. "I'm not here to ask you to retract it. Not here to tell you to phrase it differently. I just want to know why." Torres took a breath, then answered, "Because I saw, and because if I stayed silent, I'd be no different from the one who acted." "You didn't touch her," Raymond pressed. "You didn't pull her collar, didn't shove, didn't curse. Why tie yourself to this?" Torres looked down at his hands, the small calluses near his thumbs, remnants from years of training. He remembered the lesson about observing without intervening unless there was a clear threat. He had learned it right, understood it right. But when Harlan yanked that woman's collar and the sound of ripping cloth filled the air, that correctness suddenly felt like evasion. "Because I stood there," Torres said softly, and did nothing. Raymond leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. What do you think the rest of the department will make of this? You won't be one of us anymore. You'll be the guy people glance at and then walk past in silence. Maybe, Torres said, but I don't want to become someone I have to look away from when I see myself. The silence stretched, pressing tight. Raymond didn't respond immediately. He took out a small notebook, flipped through a few pages, then set his pen down on the table. You know, I got a complaint about Harlan 3 years ago, he said without looking up. I recorded it, but didn't escalate. Thought it wasn't worth ending a man's career. Thought it wasn't quite enough. Torres looked up, surprise flickering across his face for the first time. Raymond wrote something on a slip of paper, tore it out, folded it, and slid it across the table. This is the case number. It's still in the system, in case you need it. He stood up without another word, just placed a hand on Torres's shoulder and gave a firm squeeze. We don't need a lot of brave people, he said quietly. Just one who doesn't step back at the wrong time. And this time, it wasn't me. The door closed behind him. Torres sat alone, the folded paper between his hands, and for the first time in weeks, felt like the truth didn't have to be carried alone. Torres stayed a few minutes after Lieutenant Hall left. The folded paper sat in the center of the table like an unread ending. The overhead light had dimmed, but still weighed heavily. He opened the paper and read the familiar handwriting. Just an old case code. No instructions, no wish of luck. Just a clue. A quiet nod from someone who once trusted rules, now trusting something else. As he walked through the hallway to internal operations, a young officer eyed him while holding an open file. Torres didn't explain, didn't lower his head. For the first time in years, wearing the badge, he knew exactly where he stood. During lunch, someone joked in the staff room. He heard you got called up this morning. Torres smiled. Probably the shoes. A small laugh, but no follow-up. Not out of fear of him, but fear of what might be said. In this line of work, silence had always been safety. Speaking made others uneasy. Back at his desk, his inbox had a new file, sent anonymously. It was the internal report from 3 years ago. Redacted lines, blurred statements, the stamp, handled internally, insufficient evidence. Torres read it all. He wondered, if someone had asked what insufficient really meant back then, maybe Dana's collar wouldn't have been torn. Maybe the video wouldn't exist. Maybe he wouldn't have to carry this now. Later, he stood and walked to HR. No bag, no speech. Just the old case code and his original report. At the door, he left a white envelope. No name, only, I can't keep going if I can't sleep. He didn't knock. He didn't look back, not from pride, but because he knew what would be there. Pressure, expectations, and silence dressed as loyalty. A few staff saw the envelope but didn't touch it. For a moment, the room felt different, like it finally held something real. Torres walked out, not fast, not slow, not out of fear, but because he had made a choice, and this time, it didn't need approval. The special hearing room was unusually crowded. Though it wasn't a voting session, every seat was filled. Lawmakers stood in line to speak, papers stacked high before them, but their eyes were fixed on the woman in the center. No badge, no nameplate, just a calm stance and a voice that didn't waver. Dana wore a simple white blouse, hair tied back. She had chosen plainness not to impress, but to avoid being misunderstood again. When given the floor, she didn't talk about the street incident. Instead, she recalled a memory. That day, I was getting ready for work when my 6th-grade son asked, Mom, what should I wear so I don't look suspicious? The room went still. He didn't ask to look good or be praised. He asked how not to be seen as dangerous. I told him, just wear what you normally do. But I changed my shirt before stepping out. Her voice was quiet, but it cut deeper than outrage. Dana went on. My son is older now, but he still asks, will this shirt get me stopped? In this country, kids don't ask, will today go well? They ask, will I get stopped today? And I don't know how to protect him from that question. When I couldn't protect myself, she looked at the officials, not with defiance, but with the need to be seen. I'm not here for pity. I just want to ask, if clothing decides who gets questioned, then who is justice really for? No one replied. Phones buzzed in pockets. and a few people stared down at their notes without turning the page. Someone whispered, "I've never heard it put that way, and I can't argue with it." Dana left the room quietly. Her words didn't demand sympathy. They left behind a question that couldn't be dismissed. The next morning, headlines quoted her son's question, "What do you wear so you won't be suspected?" People posted their memories of asking that silently, in parking lots, classrooms, and at bus stops. Just one sentence revealed a truth many had carried alone, and long after Dana had gone, the silence in the chamber remained, not because there was nothing to say, but because the words weren't ready to answer. A conservative representative from Florida adjusted the microphone, voice low but firm, seeming to restore balance. "Let me refocus. If police are stripped of the power to suspect, what tools do they have left to protect themselves in risky situations? We can't expect them to act only after something goes wrong." At the back of the room, Malik, the man Dana once helped during Katrina, stood. He didn't need a mic. His voice was steady, not loud, but each word landed with weight. "And if civilians don't have the right to walk without fear of being pulled back mid-step, to wonder each morning what shirt color will be seen as a threat, then what do we call this system besides armed occupation?" Some frowned, others nodded slightly. Malik continued, "I was a soldier. I know the difference between keeping order and asserting control. On the battlefield, we didn't call touching civilians without permission reasonable suspicion. We called it a violation. And if that's not allowed abroad, why is it accepted in our streets?" The question fell like a stone in still water, not loud, but spreading in waves. An older congressman, silver-haired, leaned toward his aide, speaking just low enough to avoid the mic. "This isn't just a harassment case anymore. This is a moral test of the system." The aide looked up, young, maybe not 30, still holding his pen mid-note. "Sir, if that's true, how are we answering it?" The congressman looked down at his nameplate, then toward the seat Dana had once occupied. Empty, but it seemed to hold an echo, not of guilt or accusation, but a quiet reminder. If silence continues today, who will be pulled back next time? The hearing moved on to the next agenda item, but the tone had shifted. No one said it aloud, but every question that followed, from reform budgets to conduct standards, carried an added layer. A layer not printed in the draft, but revealed in the choices people made, to speak or stay quiet. Malik said nothing more. He left after the next segment, gave no press quotes, but that night a clip of his words appeared on the front page of a veterans forum. The only headline read, "I was a soldier, I didn't learn to suspect women in pale blue dress shirts." Just days after the hearing, a quiet ripple spread from the Capitol to satellite states. No official statement, no sensational headlines, yet sealed files nearly a decade old began surfacing at federal justice offices. Folders marked permanently closed were reopened under emergency review by internal oversight committees. In Michigan, a former prosecutor uncovered a report he'd archived. Oddly, the digital version no longer matched the original. Notes missing, witness statements gone, and every altered page stamped with the phrase, Clause 327, not affecting agency image. That phrase soon appeared too often to ignore. In California, a veteran journalist discovered 4 law enforcement violence cases previously dismissed for lack of direct violation, but before and after copies of the same reports told a different story. The original mentioned, "Officer grabbed the victim's bag, causing scratches and bruising." The revised version read, "Brief physical contact, no serious consequence." Officials called it a technical mismatch, but the uniform edits and language patterns made the excuse collapse. Clause 327, meant only as a non-binding internal note, was being used to erase truths deemed inconvenient. In Texas, a clerk resigned the morning a review team flagged 7 altered reports. Her letter read, "I no longer know if I served justice or enabled systemic erasure." The federal government responded by halting all post-incident edits to civilian files from the past 10 years. Emergency meetings were convened across states. Police chiefs were summoned to explain why a non-binding clause had acted as a shield, overriding legal protocol. Dana said nothing during those days. She simply returned to the park, where it all began. Her story was no longer isolated. It became the anchor, pulling other truths to the surface. What shocked people wasn't just what had been hidden, but how the system had taught them that rewriting a sentence would erase a voice. In Ohio, a law student uploaded a side-by-side comparison of altered documents, captioned, "If an agency needs to rewrite others' words to protect itself, the problem isn't the words." Across the country, former records clerks, data editors, and compliance officers were called to closed-door hearings by the Federal Oversight Commission. No immediate charges, no threats, only one direct, unavoidable question. Who ordered these changes, and why was a non-binding clause treated as law? The responses were nearly identical. We were just following procedure. No one denied the edits. They didn't dispute the altered records either. But no names were given, no documents signed in fresh ink, only hundreds of scanned files with auto-generated system notes. A retired former employee from the Department of the Interior stood up during a hearing in New York and spoke with a voice both calm and tired. When the whole department sees deleting a line as a technical filter, you stop thinking of it as a decision. You just think you're keeping the system running. Others in the room nodded quietly. They had all stood before the same instruction boards, followed the same manuals, where what was right got buried under what was allowed. Across college campuses, dissent spread fast. A group of Yale law students held a public reading of redacted lines from old reports. One student, Elena, posted online, "If truth has to be edited to protect an institution's reputation, then that reputation was never built on ethics." Her words were shared thousands of times overnight. At a high school in Seattle, a civics class reenacted the hearing. The teacher split the students into two groups, one as record keepers, the other as those whose records were changed. When it was a student's turn to play the censor, he stood still for a moment, then said, "I don't know why I did it, just that everyone else did." Under a post about the real Capitol Hill hearing, a sociology student from Georgia wrote, "If everyone follows the rules, but the outcome is still wrong, then the rules are guilty." That sentence was soon quoted in meetings, speeches, and printed on a banner outside the Capitol during a peaceful protest. The phrase, "the rules are guilty," became a symbol of resistance. It didn't target individuals. It didn't demand that the system be burned down, but it pointed to what many had ignored, that harm doesn't only come from those who break the rules. Sometimes it's those who follow them without question who keep the damage going longest. Inside a small print shop in Missouri, an old man began printing white flyers with one line centered on each page. A flawed system isn't excused by the fact that everyone followed it. He didn't include the author's name or any contact information. To the first customer, he simply said, "I used to think justice came from above. Now I think maybe it starts when people stop saying, 'I was just doing my job.'" As system reforms spread, the Illinois State Police Academy became one of the first institutions required to review its curriculum. The pressure came not from officials or media, but from newly graduated officers. They submitted a joint petition with evidence showing that risk assessment slides were based not on behavior, but on appearance, skin color, and clothing, teaching a generation to see threats, not to protect. In a closed curriculum meeting, a senior instructor held up a printed slide from the year 2015. Covered clothing, no bag, standing still for over 3 minutes, high risk. He folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and said he would not teach unless it was removed. Two younger instructors nodded. The room fell silent until the chair drew a red line through the document and ruled, "Remove all subjective profiling from ethics training." On campus, where the usual sound was students' synchronized marching, a small group whispered, "Then what exactly have we been learning?" One cadet, Alea, answered, "We've been taught to fear the wrong people more than to understand the right things." She had spoken during a simulated public hearing and now represented a new wave of officers. The academy invited veterans, sociologists, and even victims of wrongful stops to speak. One of the first guests was Malik. He didn't mention Katrina or Dana's video. He showed a photo of a woman in a pale blue dress shirt tending to a hurt child. She saved my brother. She wore almost the same thing the day her blouse was torn, and to one officer, that outfit looked suspicious. Some cadets lowered their heads. Others froze mid-note. One later wrote in his training journal, "We should have been taught to read people by their actions, not their collars." New slides were added that week. Instructors didn't erase the old ones, but placed them alongside consequences and critiques. The new lesson title read, "What We Used to Teach and Why We Don't Anymore." A screenshot of the first Reformed class circulated online. On the screen, mistaking someone as a threat can't be the price of safety. Someone printed it and taped it to the dorm wall where the next community interaction class would be held. The atmosphere didn't ease. Some upperclassmen were openly unhappy, but the change had begun, not through bans or slogans, but by admitting the most dangerous lessons were the ones never taught. That morning, the ethics class opened with a discussion, written on the whiteboard. What's enough to suspect? The room stayed quiet for a while. Then a male cadet stood, serious, and asked, not to challenge but to understand, if we no longer rely on appearance or clothing, then what do we use to assess field situations? The senior instructor, Mr. Riley, with 27 years of teaching at the academy and nearly 10 in the field, set the training manual on the desk. He looked around the room, eyes steady. His voice was low and firm. Not body type, not clothing. We assess based on behavior, specific action patterns, and observable risk levels. And if suspicion isn't backed by clear evidence, you have no right to act. He paused, letting each word settle into the air, tight as wire. Another hand went up. It was Alea, the cadet, who had once spoken during the Southside community hearing. What if a superior gives an order without evidence? Riley nodded slowly, as if expecting that question. Then, the only thing you have left is your conscience. And conscience isn't trained through commands, but through what you choose to overlook or not. No one was taking notes. The class sat upright as if this was the most important lesson they'd ever heard. A female cadet in the back quietly pulled out her phone and recorded Riley's reply. That clip was later trimmed to 42 seconds and uploaded to a popular video platform with a caption. The video spread faster than expected. In a society used to swapping intuition for reason, that clip served as a reminder. Intuition without responsibility is just bias in the guise of caution. Dozens of industry accounts shared it, from training academies to young officer groups nationwide. A veteran officer left a comment, "I used to teach them how to spot suspects. Now I'm learning from the students." Soon after, a law enforcement journal ran an editorial titled, "When Behavior Replaces Surface Judgment." It concluded, "For the first time in our training history, what's erased from the slide isn't a line of text, it's a habit." A week later, at the National Reform Conference, the session opened with that very recording. In a hall filled with officials, instructors, and policymakers, Riley's words played again, this time not as instruction, but as a declaration from a generation relearning from the roots. To be a cop, first you must have the courage not to act when the cost is justice lost. There was no press conference, no formal announcement, but across major academies and police departments, resignation letters began to appear on training directors' desks, sealed in internal envelopes. The ones signing them weren't recruits with years ahead, but veteran instructors, those who had taught hundreds of cadets and shaped the backbone of the profession. At the Illinois State Police Academy, Mr. Brantley was the first to leave. Known to cadets as Mr. Brant, he had taught for nearly 30 years. After the ethics curriculum was revised, he entered the dean's office, placed his resignation letter down, and said, "I don't know how to teach if I no longer believe in what I say." He wasn't angry, nor did he oppose change, but he understood one thing. The framework that had defined his entire career was no longer the core of the institution. Days later, in Georgia, former tactical instructor Morales submitted his early retirement. "I'm not leaving in protest," he wrote. "I'm leaving because I no longer feel confident representing what I once believed was right." Decorated for bravery in a hostage rescue, he admitted in his final interview, "I taught people how to gain control, but never how to tell the difference between control and coercion. I think it's time someone else did it better." Local precincts saw silent farewells. No parties, no banners. A young officer in Minnesota recalled that day, "My old chief just said, 'Watch each other's backs, but not the wrong things.' Then he walked out with his bag. No one followed." These exits barely stirred public reaction, but inside the system they marked a quiet, deep shift. Figures once seen as pillars of tradition stepped back so they wouldn't obstruct reform. No one blamed them. No one begged them to stay. Everyone understood. Some things can't be retaught if the teacher hasn't relearned them first. At a closed meeting in an Eastern academy, when asked why he wouldn't adapt, a senior lecturer replied, "I don't think what I know is wrong. But if it's used to hide what's right, I shouldn't be standing at the podium." In Chicago, cadets were assigned a final essay, "What I won't teach if I become an instructor." One wrote, "I won't teach suspicion based on how someone walks. I won't teach silence as safety, and I won't teach that following procedure always means doing what's right." The paper earned full marks. The instructor's note read, "Because of people like you, those who once learned wrong and chose to relearn, this field still has a chance to repair itself." The departure of veteran instructors wasn't the end. It was space, so new lessons could be written without erasing the past. The past didn't need denial, only honesty. And if someone dared to say, "I once taught that, but I won't teach it again," then maybe, just maybe, there's still hope for this profession. On Saturday afternoon, the second-floor community room at the Southside Library filled before the event even began. Malik organized the gathering after a request from the local veterans group. He called it the conversation left unspoken. Not a forum, not a debate, just a space for those who had witnessed, stayed silent, or hesitated to ask again. Dana arrived 10 minutes early. She didn't say much. She smiled, greeted people, and then sat like any guest. A few recognized her, but no one lifted a phone. Here, it seemed everyone understood that a real story is meant to be heard, not replayed for views. Malik opened by recalling the moment he saw Dana in the video. "I didn't recognize her by her face. I recognized the way she held her balance when pulled back. That's the calm of someone who saved lives and never needed to be remembered by name." The room stayed silent, not from emotion, but from recognition. After a few moments, the mic passed hands. A young woman, a former police trainee, raised hers. "I trained in a system where silence was called calm and compliance was called professional. If I had witnessed that and done nothing, was I complicit?" Malik didn't answer right away. He looked at Dana. Dana nodded. Her voice was steady. "I'm not here to call anyone complicit, but if you saw it, and you knew it wasn't right, then the question isn't whether you were complicit. It's whether you're ready to act differently next time." An older man nodded slowly. He was a retired patrol officer. "We were taught to react in 4 seconds, but no one taught us what to do if that reaction was wrong." The next questions didn't come from anger. They came from uncertainty, from years of believing that following the procedure was enough. A white young man stood and spoke quietly. "I was in the same class as the judge's daughter. I knew she recorded it, but I just watched. I didn't stop him. I don't know if I can still call myself a good person." Dana didn't blame him. Malik didn't comfort him. They let him speak and let the silence that followed carry the answer. Near the end, a high school student held the mic and asked, "How do you know when to speak up?" Malik looked at Dana. She stood, stepped into the circle, no notes, no speech. Her voice wasn't loud or tearful, but each word carried weight. "I'm not here to remind anyone of what they got wrong or when they stayed quiet. Maybe you were scared, unsure, or didn't think it was that bad. I don't need to know who was wrong." She looked around the room, eyes steady. "I just need to know who doesn't want to be wrong anymore." In that moment, the room paused. No one spoke. No applause was needed. Everyone there understood the most important thing had just been said, not about past truth, but about present will. The gathering ended without ceremony. People rose quietly, nodding their farewells. A young woman left the library, opened her phone, and typed into her status bar, "I don't know if I was ever right, but I know I can't move forward pretending I never stood still." Not long after the Southside Library Forum, a group of students in law, journalism, and systems design gathered in a small room behind their university. They had no funding, no formal organizing board, but shared a question: how can ordinary people tell what happened to them without needing permission? That question became the foundation of a quiet but ambitious project, Voiceless Journal. The name came from a remark Dana made during a recent event. Not everyone has a mic, and not everyone with a mic gets truly heard. They wanted to build a space where the mic belonged to no one, but could be used by anyone. A platform that didn't ask for ID, case numbers, or documentation. Just one condition: you had to have lived a moment when the system refused to believe you because of how you looked, spoke, or walked. Voiceless Journal's interface was basic, almost raw. A gray and white screen, one empty input field, no login, no email, no verification code. At the top, a single line: if you've ever been treated like your existence was a nuisance, this is a place to tell it. In the first 3 days, over 200 stories were submitted. A woman recalled being asked to open her trunk just for having brown skin and wearing a headscarf. A 14-year-old boy described being held for 30 minutes after school just for walking fast. An elderly Puerto Rican man remembered having his flu medicine inspected at the hospital while the white man beside him wasn't questioned at all. No one verified the accuracy, but no one used these accounts to prosecute or rally protest either. Voiceless Journal didn't function like a court. It was more like a collective diary. Every story appeared exactly as submitted, unedited, not sorted by severity. Because of the founders, a system that once decided who deserved to be heard had no right to judge whose pain deserved to be recorded. Malik was invited to the platform launch but declined to speak. He sat in the back, listening. When asked why he didn't say anything, he replied, "Because I think what this system needs most is to not be steered, even by good intentions." Dana also heard about Voiceless Journal, and for the first time opened her computer to read the voices of people she'd never met, yet somehow felt she had known her whole life. One entry was just 3 lines. "They didn't call my name. They called me what they thought I was, but I kept walking under my real name." These lines didn't appear in the news, didn't go viral, and weren't cited in policy meetings, but they carried weight differently, quietly, steadily, like a heartbeat inside a body long forgotten. A neighborhood literature teacher used Voiceless Journal in class. Each week, students picked a story at random, no names, and rewrote their reflections from the perspective of a neighbor. The goal wasn't fact-checking. It was to learn how not to look away when someone begins to speak. Voiceless Journal doesn't promise to change laws, but it gives people who once lost the right to be believed something essential: the space to tell what they lived without needing permission. It was started by Jenna Lay, a final-year law student who once tracked Harlan's altered reports. She avoids cameras, doesn't call herself an activist. When asked why she stayed anonymous, she said, "I didn't want the story to shift from what's written to who wrote it." For her, a real platform has no center. It lets people come in freely, not follow faces. After 5 days, as traffic spiked, civil rights groups and one federal office offered funding or integration. Janelle declined all. Her only reply: "If we're protected, we'll be controlled. But if we're heard freely, that's real." Some called her naive. Others questioned her logic, but many started asking, do silenced stories need power to matter, or just listeners who don't ask for proof? Janelle kept running the site from a small rented room near the park where Dana had once stood. Each morning she filtered spam, removed abuse, and approved every honest story. No ranking, no edits, no comments. One post from Idaho told of a father stopped at a school gate for not looking like a parent. Another, just 2 lines, from New Jersey: "They didn't hit me, but the look they gave taught me to lower my head. The only option, read." In 3 weeks, over 500 stories came in. Some from citizens, others from insiders who had never said what haunted them most. A former officer wrote, "I told cadets if unsure, check. Now I know. Checking doesn't mean you're right, it means you have power." Janelle sorted nothing by race, region, or rank, only by time. Every story stayed equal. As one professor wrote, "In a world where stories push agendas, Janelle made a space where a story is just that, a story." When asked about the future, Janelle always said, "I don't know." But every time someone writes, "I've never told this before," this space still matters. At the entrance of the second floor of the South Side Community Library, where the forum between Dana and Malik once took place, a new wooden frame had been mounted. It didn't display a portrait or announcement board, but a white dress shirt, the kind often worn by middle-aged women on an ordinary workday. On the left chest, where the fabric had once been torn, it had now been sewn back together with red thread. The stitches were uneven, the creases unhidden, as if the one who mended it didn't intend to make it new, but wanted others to remember just how badly it had been ripped. Just below it, hand-stitched on a small piece of fabric, were the words, "I wasn't a threat, I was just standing in the wrong place, under the wrong gaze." She had arrived early one morning, asked a staff member to unlock the library, and hung the shirt herself. When the librarian asked if she wanted to say something to visitors, she shook her head and replied, "No need to say anything. If they were there, they'll understand." Then she left, just like any other reader. The shirt became the center of quiet conversations. A mother brought her son to the library, paused for a long moment before the frame, and leaned down to whisper, "Remember, you're not wrong just because someone doesn't understand you." A young man in a work jacket stood looking for a long time, then silently took out his phone to take a photo. He didn't post it online. He printed the picture, folded it neatly, and kept it in his wallet. A few days later, a group of high school students attending an extracurricular program at the library held a painting session under the theme of "A moment in our community's history that needs to be retold." While many chose scenes of protests or heated council meetings, 5 students chose what seemed like a simple scene, Dana being pulled by her shirt. They didn't copy the video or recreate the exact moment of tearing. In their painting, Dana stood in the park, trees casting shade behind her, and an empty bench nearby. A faceless officer approached, hand already on her collar. But the most striking difference was Dana's posture. Her left hand was raised, not to cover her chest, not to defend, but directed at the onlooker, as if to hold that gaze, forcing it to look more clearly before judging. Her face was drawn with calm features, as if saying, "If you look at me with different eyes, I will still be here, not stepping back." Below the painting, the students wrote a caption in their handwriting, "Not to push back, but to hold still what was wrongly seen." The painting was placed next to the shirt, creating a dialogue in images between the reality that had once occurred and the way a new generation chose to remember it. No one told the students they had to draw it accurately or include every correct detail. They were simply told, "Tell it as honestly as you feel." One mother, upon seeing the painting, began to cry, not because of any tragic detail, but because she noticed the shift. The girl no longer draws the harmed person with their face down, they draw the hand raised. That is a change bigger than any meeting I've ever attended. The next day, someone chalked on the library steps, "Not everyone has a voice, but everyone has a shape that deserves to be seen right." Dana walked past the words and nodded, not in thanks, but as a quiet acknowledgement that a new way of seeing was taking shape, and this time, she didn't have to stay silent to be heard. Not long after her portrait was hung beside the mended shirt, a high school teacher sent a photo of it to a friend in education. It wasn't art to display, it was a symbol. The first thing people see isn't always the truth, it's a habit. From that image came the Rethink First Look campaign. No government logo, no big sponsors, just educators, parents, and psychologists who understood that bias doesn't begin in courtrooms, it begins with how we're taught to look at one another. The campaign's poster showed Dana, hand raised, Gaze steady. No slogan, just one line. If the first look is reflex, the second is a choice. Schools received it with guides full of quiet questions. When did you last judge someone on looks? Have you changed your mind after really talking to someone? Would you say hello to someone who looks different? Students weren't asked to confess or explain. They just sat, reflected, and read their thoughts aloud. One student wrote, "I thought she was arrogant because she was quiet. But she listens more than anyone." When asked why Dana was chosen as the symbol, the team said, "Because she didn't flinch, she faced it." And sometimes that's what starts a shift. Dana said nothing online. When a student asked how she felt, she said, "If I knew this would happen, maybe I wouldn't have gone into the park, but I did." So someone has to walk out with a better view. One morning, a brief news ticker scrolled across the screen. Officer Harlan Brett dismissed for violating body search procedures. It sounded routine, but for those who followed Dana's case, it marked a turning point. The police department's statement cited a procedural lapse that harmed the agency's image, leading to Brett's termination. There was no mention of Dana, the torn shirt, or the viral video. Yet everyone understood the lapse was the moment her shirt was ripped. And she didn't flinch. Brett avoided the spotlight, with his lawyer declining interviews. While fringe outlets called it media surrender, the general public stayed quiet. The point wasn't removing one man. It was making sure no one else suffered another tear. Around that time, Officer Felicia Monroe submitted her resignation. She wasn't involved in the case, but had quietly attended the library forum. Later, she read Dana's handwritten letter posted at the precinct. Ended with, "I can't imagine if that had been your sister." Those words pierced something Felicia had long buried. The silent moments she watched others get questioned for looking off, the raised hands no one reached for. She once believed she could change the system from within, but after reading that letter, she asked herself, if I follow procedure but stay silent, am I changing anything? Felicia filed a simple letter. I believed good intentions were enough, but they aren't if I remain part of something broken. Her supervisor accepted it without a word. News of her resignation spread. Some called her weak, others quietly admitted, I've felt the same but never dared. Felicia didn't reply. She wasn't seeking praise, just a night's rest free from guilt. Dana never met Felicia, but weeks later she received a package, a removed police badge, and a note. I didn't keep it because I won't let it hide what I believe. Soon after, small ripples of change reached classrooms. It wasn't from laws or news coverage, but from teachers quietly helping students grow up without assuming someone's guilt based on their skin or how fast they walk. Mr. Marcus Liu, a high school teacher in Minnesota, proposed a new class after reading about Rethink First Look and Voiceless Journal. He called it Bias Awareness in Public Service. No grades, no final exam, just one aim: make students question what they've accepted. The first lesson opened with one question on the board. Have you ever been treated as a risk based on how you looked? No one had to answer aloud. After class, a student left a note. Security made me take off my hat and open my bag. My white friend didn't have to. The course focused not on headlines but on daily public service. Schools, clinics, offices, students read real stories from Voiceless Journal and asked whether bias shaped the officials' actions. There were no clear answers, only habits to unpack. In New Jersey, a teacher asked students to bring a family photo and ask, how would this person be treated at a public office? One realized her dad had been denied entry to a museum for wearing an old army jacket. Another remembered her mom being referred to as that woman, even after showing ID. Some schools resisted, calling the topic too sensitive. But those who kept the course noticed a change. Students started asking not just what their rights were, but how they'd use power fairly. One boy asked, if my superior says check that guy because he looks odd, what should I do? His teacher answered, what would it take for you to stop asking that? At semester's end, a teacher wrote on a report, you struggle with essays, but you were the first to ask why police don't apologize for stopping the wrong person. That tells me you understand justice. Since the day he recognized Dana in the viral video and chose to break his silence, Malik had become the community's unofficial voice. No title, no badge, rarely on television, yet his words echoed through libraries, hearings, and notes on public walls. So, when the Illinois Judicial Reform Committee sought new advisors, the first name suggested wasn't a law professor, it was Malik. The official invitation arrived by post, bearing the state's seal, politely requesting his participation as one of 8 policy advisors. He would have speaking rights, voting power, and influence over policy, under formal procedures, time limits, and closed hearings. Malik sat with the letter for hours. He didn't call Dana or Janelle. He just read, folded it, and tucked it into a drawer. That evening, he emailed the committee clerk a short, calm reply. "I'm not made for swivel chairs. I stand better than I sit." Confused, a board member called, urging him to reconsider. "This is your chance to help shape policy. You'll be officially heard." Malik answered, "I don't need to be heard officially. I need to say things that aren't erased when time runs out." He didn't dismiss those who worked within the system. He knew reform needed people on both sides. But to him, real change didn't come from boardrooms. It rose from ordinary people forced to speak because they had no other choice. So Malik stayed where he was, running civil rights workshops for immigrants, bringing students to courtrooms, showing how one misjudgment can ruin a life. He used no microphones or digital slides, just true stories and a plastic chair. Yet rooms filled. Because when Malik spoke, he didn't speak for others. He spoke so others could speak too. Some said he passed up a chance to become a high-level activist. Malik didn't care for titles. He said, "I don't need a role. I need to know that if I sit down, someone else will stand. But if I'm sitting just to hold a seat, I'd rather leave it to someone who still needs to rise." A week later, a package arrived from students who once heard him speak. Inside was a hand-drawn map, not of roads, but of places where people once silenced had stood to speak. The park where Dana's blouse was pulled. The classroom where Felicia resigned. At the center, a figure stood, not holding signs or fists, just upright, eyes steady. Below, handwritten, "Thank you for not sitting still." Dana's nomination to the city council wasn't symbolic or a move to calm public pressure. It came from a young council member who had attended that same library hearing where Dana said one sentence that made the room stop and think. "I don't need to know who was wrong. I just need to know who no longer wants to be." The invitation letter was sent to the community library, where Dana still came weekly to help with children's reading sessions. It said the community needed people who speak not only when hurt, but who can listen even without anger. It emphasized the role required. No administrative experience, only something rarely taught: integrity in silence. Dana read the letter in the reading room, her hand resting on an open book. She said nothing, just sat still until the lines blurred under the slanting afternoon sun. She folded the letter, placed it in her bag, and left without telling anyone. The council meeting took place the following Thursday morning in a modest room that seated nearly 30. Dana entered in a simple dress, no belt, no jacket. She brought no notes. When invited to speak, she stepped up, hands free, gaze steady. Her first words were not thanks. "Before you vote, I have one question." She looked at each member, not sharply, not hurried. "If I hadn't been pulled back that day, hadn't been commented on, hadn't been filmed, would any of you have thought I belonged here?" No one answered. Some looked down, some adjusted their glasses, and some pressed their lips. The question wasn't meant to be answered, just faced, because they all knew, without the video, without the uproar, Dana would still be just a nameless woman walking into the library each morning. She didn't speak long. "I didn't come here to be a symbol," she continued. "I don't want to be the name used to prove the system knows how to make amends. I just want to know, if you choose me, is it because you believe I can contribute, or because I was treated so wrongly it couldn't be ignored?" There was no applause, no promises, just silence, the kind that meant the room finally understood that appointing someone wasn't just a nomination, but a long overdue recognition. As Dana stepped down, the chair simply said, "We'll proceed to vote." No one motioned to delay. No one asked for more discussion. Ballots were collected. After 15 minutes, the results were announced. All members voted to appoint Dana as the new civilian representative. No one explained why. No one defended past views. They stayed silent, not out of fear, but because some things must be done, however late. Dana left before the closing remarks. On her way home, she passed the park where it all happened. The wind was light. The bench where she once sat reading was still there. She didn't stop, didn't bow her head. She walked on, as if the path had opened, no longer needing apology, no longer needing reminder, just steps taken without turning away. That morning, Chicago skies were unusually overcast for late spring. Dana stepped into the old bookstore at the far end of Southside, the one with a weathered wooden sign and a doorbell that let out a soft chime whenever someone walked in. No one recognized her at first. No one waited to greet her, and that was exactly what she wanted. That bookstore was where it all began, not in the sense of conflict, but because before the day her blouse was pulled, she used to stop by weekly. Each visit, she would read just one chapter, then place the book back. No one urged her to buy. No one asked questions. Only the quiet of paper and words remained. This time, she went straight to the back shelf, where the philosophy and political theory books rarely saw attention. Her finger paused on a pale gray cover, Understanding Systemic Assumptions. Not a bestseller, not a new release, but she remembered skimming it years ago, then scoffing, closing it, and thinking, who believes any of this can change the system? Now, standing before that same book, she pulled it from the shelf, brought it to the counter, and left just enough cash, asking for no change. The elderly bookseller nodded instead of speaking. No one asked for an autograph. No one filmed her. And that silence was the exact reply Dana needed. As she stepped out, a child, perhaps 10 years old, walking with his mother, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are you the lady from the video?" he asked, not loudly, not judgmentally, just honestly. Dana bent down, gently touched his shoulder, and smiled. "No, I'm the one who walked out of it." The air softened, as if she had just set down a piece of burden herself. The video no longer held her captive in the role of a victim. She had walked beyond it with calm, by not allowing the past to shape her entire being. Out on the street, people still spoke of hearings, reopened cases, and newly proposed policies. Dana didn't attend many. She continued teaching children to read, receiving nameless postcards from those she had once quietly helped, and whenever someone asked, "What do you want to teach the next generation?" she didn't talk about resilience or pain. She simply said, "Teach them to look again," even if the first look was right or wrong. Because for Dana, the greatest lesson wasn't in anger finally acknowledged or pain eventually compensated. It was in this: a person once seen as a threat can still become the one who steadies the balance, not through power, but through how they walk. Without flinching. It wasn't a victory. It was a reminder that no one is born ready to do right, but everyone can choose not to keep doing wrong. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing still, not with fists, not with words, but with a steady gaze, to shift a whole society's reflex. Dana never named what she did. She simply called it choosing to stay. And maybe, in a time when everything gets swept up by speed, that choice is the only way for an ordinary person not to vanish in the noise. That afternoon, the old librarian closed early, not to rest, but to take time to write something on the front glass he cleaned every day, a habit without a name. For years, the little bookstore had no slogans, no flyers, no announcements, just a quiet door for those who needed silence. But that day, he brought out a black brush pen, pressed it firmly, and wrote slowly, deliberately across the glass, "The moment he ripped her blouse, the system began to rip itself open." No capital letters, no bold borders, just a sentence, quiet and firm, like a first crack across something once thought unbreakable. Passers-by paused. Some nodded, some walked on. No one erased it, no one protested, because they understood. Sometimes the words least spoken are the ones that must last longest. As the evening light slanted through the window, that line cast a shadow across the floor like a backward stitch, one not meant to hide the tear, but to mark the place where truth might begin to mend something that had long since come undone. She was never chosen as a spokesperson, never received a medal, and never gave a speech at any commemorative event. But her name was repeated in the strangest places, in an ethics class in a small town, in the testimony of a young officer who refused to enable wrongdoing, in the eyes of a student who, for the first time, wondered why his mother always walked faster when she saw police behind them. She didn't change the entire system, but she forced it to look at itself, not through a scream, but by refusing to turn pain into a bargaining chip. Dana didn't retaliate. She simply stood there, as fully human as anyone deserves to be, not more, not pleading to be less, and let society decide whether that was worthy of respect. There were protests held afterward, policies revised, training slides removed, and terms like professional instinct began to be replaced with reasonable evidence. But deeper than all those changes was a quiet shift, where people no longer rushed to trust their first reflex, but learned to pause, look closely, and ask themselves, am I doing this to stay safe or just to stay biased? No one called Dana a hero. She never claimed to be one, but what she left behind was a kind of silence that made it harder for others to simply look away, a silence that didn't ask to be heard, but made others listen. And perhaps that legacy wasn't written in case files or printed in any new law, but lived in the fact that, from that day on, whenever someone walked into a bookstore, a park, or just down a quiet street, they would ask themselves once more, am I seeing a person, or am I only looking out of habit? If that question lasts long enough in each generation, then what's right might not arrive too late.